Okay, welcome back, everybody. Good to see everyone. We had a fantastic first couple of days, and so thrilled to have you here for our closing day of programming. If everybody could come in and take a seat, we are about to get started with our opening panel. Thanks for a great couple of days of discussion. We've got a great lineup today. But first, a reminder for everyone, one way to stay engaged with New Deal all year long is through our award-winning podcast. I think I see Ryan Coonerty has been somewhere around here, our founder. We've loved featuring many of you as guests on the show. I look forward to talking to more New Deal leaders about how you are solving problems and your path to public service. If you haven't already, we just asked you to please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating to help us boost the podcast and better promote all of you. And of course, for the New Deal leaders, please reach out if you'd like to be on the show. With that, we're going to start this morning with a session on 2025 policy priorities that go really to the heart of New Deal's mission, ideas for expanding economic opportunity for all Americans. First up, I want to welcome Rhett Buttle, founder of Public-Private Strategies and the president of the Public-Private Strategies Institute, which brings together the public and private sectors to build coalitions and campaigns and creates partnerships that drive policy and market outcomes. Joining Rhett will be New Deal leader, St. Louis Mayor Tishaura Jones, John Lettieri, co-founder and CEO of the nationally recognized Economic Innovation Group, and we have Angie Cooper, Executive Vice President of Heartland Forward, which is a think and do tank working as a resource for states and communities to advance economic success. So join me in welcoming Rhett and all of the panelists.
Awesome. That is on. Well, good morning, everyone. All right, we'll try one more time because it's early. Good morning. Good morning. I have to say the applause was actually pretty good, so like the piece. But it's so great to be with you all this morning, and I've had the privilege of just popping in the last few days and having a lot of the conversations about where we are and where we go from here, but I think most importantly to just be in community with good people who are doing work on the ground. And I'm super excited to be joined by this amazing panel because I think it goes without question that the future of our economy and how we create an inclusive economy that works for everyone is on the minds of everyone across the political spectrum and what we do. And we're joined by some amazing guests who are going to help us figure that out. And then, of course, we want to take some question and answer from you all. So with that, why don't we go ahead and hop in? I thought what I'd do is just to get the conversation going, we would hear from each panelist a little bit about the work they're doing, how they're thinking about the economy, maybe how they're thinking about their priorities for 2025. And so maybe we'll just make our way down the panel, and John can ask for you to kick us off. Tell us a little bit about the amazing work that EIG does and how you're thinking about economic policy for 2025.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here with you. First panel of the day. Everyone's still wide awake and caffeinated. That's great. So my organization is a bipartisan think tank, and so we have to think about things in the lens of where are the landing spots for both parties to come together. And obviously after an election like this where you have federal control in one party's hands, the playing field shifts a little bit from what it could have otherwise been. But I think there's some really interesting areas of opportunity that we've been focused on at EIG. And one of those is the pro-worker bucket of policy ideas. There's, I think, a great competition happening right now between the two parties, which is very healthy for democracy and healthy for our economy, that both parties are trying to define themselves as the pro-worker party. And we can argue about which party deserves that mantle more or less, but the fact that there's a competition happening in that space and that that's really the ground of the realignment happening in American politics, I think is very positive. And it creates a lot of interesting bipartisan opportunities to work together. So we're thinking about that both from a research side, but also a policy-making side. One example that I'll give, and I'm happy to talk about more as we get into this, is on issues of worker mobility. Non-compete agreements at the state level have been, for the last decade or so, under assault, and I think that's great. Policymakers at the state level have been looking at restrictions on non-compete agreements because the evidence has become so clear that they hurt entrepreneurship, they hurt wages, they hurt worker satisfaction. They're bad for the economy, but they're really bad for workers and even bad for employers too. And as the evidence has become more clear, the policymaking has become more active at the state level. That's starting to filter up to the federal level as well, where you have this interesting cross-partisan alignment of a lot of organizations, including Trump-aligned organizations, who are saying this is the frontier of pro-worker policy in this country. So I think those types of areas that are a little bit off of the radar, they're not hot-button national issues, but they are really important. High leverage and low cost. I think as we think about what's going to happen over the next couple of years, there are going to be some big ticket spending items, but the restraint on spending is really going to start kicking in, especially outside of a few priorities like tax. And so the premium is going to be, where do we get a lot of leverage in the economy? Where can we help workers? And where can we do all that without spending a lot of money? Think about how few issues fit into that bucket. And now think about how many of those can be bipartisan. It's a really small list. I think non-compete reform could be one of those issues where it's no cost, huge economic leverage, bipartisan, and backed by evidence. And so that's the kind of stuff that we're thinking about here in the wake of the election and this realignment that's happening. I think if we can lead into issues like that, that's very positive for the future of the country.
Super helpful. Next, super excited to hear a little bit more about the amazing work that Heartland Forward does. I know you all are thinking about a lot about entrepreneurship and rural communities, so tell us about the work.
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning. It's great to be here. I work for an organization called Heartland Forward, and our core mission is centered around how do we help change the narrative about the middle of the country and accelerate economic growth. And we are a nonpartisan organization as well, but we call ourselves a policy think and do tank. So we have a team of economists and researchers in-house that do applied research, and then we have programmatic and policy teams that really roll up their sleeves and think about how are we a resource for states and local communities, primarily working with governor's offices, economic development directors, mayors, and city council members. And it is interesting, and Mayor, I shared this with you earlier, when I usually say Heartland Forward, people do say rural. But one of my favorite stats about the 20 states in which we define as the heartland make up the third largest economy under the US and China. So the middle of the country is extremely important as we look at all the core issues, John, that you just mentioned. And while we look at applied research and being a resource for states and local communities, we focus truly on four main kind of pillars. The first one is innovation and entrepreneurship, and the second one is human capital and workforce development. We really, our work in those two pillars is how do we build the talent pipeline in the heartland? We can argue that when we look at state policy or federal policy and where we're putting dollars in both urban and rural areas, we've sort of separated. Innovation lives in this bucket, entrepreneurship lives in this bucket, and education and workforce development is kind of in a separate bucket. And we've siloed those issues in many ways. So we really say, how do we build the talent pipeline in the heartland? And just kind of everything we do is based upon research. So a program that we're running to help entrepreneurs just get their ideas off the sidelines at the very beginning stages. It's important because we did a report that looked at where entrepreneurship was growing across the country. And unfortunately, 75% of venture capital has gone to just 3 states on all coasts. So how do we get more money? And it's not just capital, it's how do we get more people in the game to think about they can be entrepreneurs so they can do amazing things in St. Louis or do amazing things in my hometown, Enid, Oklahoma, so we can build the talent from the ground up. We also, our third pillar that we focus on is health and wellness. And we look at health with an economic lens, because if we don't have healthy families and healthy communities, we're not driving anything forward in not just the heartland, but across the country. And we've created, and happy to dig in deeper, out of some research that we did looking at rural hospitals are closing and what do we go do about it. We've created a Heartland Health Caucus made up of policymakers across 8 Heartland states. And we've brought together, and groups like this do this, but we brought together the policy director in the governor's office, the Department of Health, and the state legislators that run the Health and Senate health committees. It's a nonpartisan group, and they're all talking to each other and sharing best practices. Some states have already expanded Medicaid, some have not, some have said, how do I do this? So we're sharing those best practices. And then a couple of big issues. We probably believe the number one economic issue of our time is access to affordable high-speed internet. We've got to make that happen. There's got to be a big push. Let's accelerate those BEAD dollars so they get out to the states. And then, of course, AI. So AI is happening everywhere in front of us, and we're looking at it to make sure, one, the Heartland's not left behind. We have the opportunity to lead. We're looking at it from a workforce perspective, but also a sustainability resource perspective. So energy and water are important to the 20 Heartland states that we think about, and so we're trying to bring those policy discussions to the table.
Super helpful. Obviously, a leader who needs no introduction. I was telling the mayor we met over 10 years ago, I think, in Washington. It's been amazing to watch your career. Obviously, from where you sit, you have a unique set of tools as you're thinking about inclusive growth. I know you've been doing a lot of work with the Aspen Institute, thinking about financial security for workers. How are you thinking about those tools sort of with where you're sitting for inclusive growth?
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Mayor Tashara Jones, and I was one of the first class. Oh, thank you. I got a little fan base over here. I was part of the first class of New Deal leaders, so some might call me an OG. So St. Louis received almost $500 million from the American Rescue Plan Act. And we deployed over half of that in what's called our Economic Justice Action Plan. And our Economic Justice Action Plan has 3 pillars to empower, develop, and transform marginalized neighborhoods. Because St. Louis, just like any other major city, has hyper segregation. Some may have seen a documentary on BBC called The Delmar Divide. Delmar is literally the dividing line between North and South St. Louis, and north of Delmar is all African American, and south of Delmar is actually obviously not all African American. I live north of Delmar by choice. That's the neighborhood I grew up in, and so my father and I have homes literally across the street from each other north of Delmar, because I got to keep my eye on that 77-year-old man. And our Economic Justice Action Plan, again, was funded primarily by ARPA, but we're using it in a revolving way, so these funds last well after the spending deadline has passed, which we all know is December 31st, 2026. And so we've also founded with our community foundation a fund called our Economic Justice Accelerator to attract private funding and philanthropic funding so we can continue our mission long after ARPA is expired. So we are investing in a myriad of ways. So our primary goals are to strengthen neighborhoods. We are building homes in areas that haven't seen a mortgage generation in 10 or 15 years. We're closing the wealth gap by building a new or rehabbing an old electrical facility. We renamed it the Monarch, and it's on Martin Luther King Boulevard because we're trying to change that horrible joke that Chris Rock used to tell. What happens when you find yourself on MLK Boulevard? Run. Well, we're changing that to stay. And so closing the wealth gap by providing resources in community, making it a world-class workforce development hub, co-located with businesses so someone could potentially walk in off the street looking for a job and we can connect them with a business on site. Improving health and education outcomes. We're also working with our school district, working with our hospital systems. We have 2 of the best hospital systems in the country, so working with them to improve health outcomes and expand the tax base and grow the population. Because St. Louis's population at the turn of the century was 800,000, almost near 1 million. And now we struggle to stay just at 300,000. So that 500,000 people left St. Louis for a myriad of reasons, primarily racism, but we won't get into that. But we are trying to grow our population and leaning into our new Americans, because that is the fastest growing population in St. Louis right now. So we established an office of new Americans so we can connect people to the resources that they need when migrant families arrive in our city. I said when, not if, because we know that that unfortunately being shipped to cities like Chicago and Denver. So we're working with those cities to make sure that when those families arrive in St. Louis, that they are connected to jobs, connected to housing, and every other resource that they need to thrive. So the overall goal is to, again, just make St. Louis that phoenix rising from the ashes, and be another, Midwest city, another heartland city that people can look to as migration patterns will start to shift around our country.
I personally love St. Louis. There's not very many places as a grown adult you can go down a slide. And obviously, if you go to the City Museum in St. Louis, you can be a full-grown child adult. So if you haven't been,
come on.
I'm sure the mayor would invite everyone over. A big theme for me throughout this conference has been, trying to find areas where, we can work together, even potentially with a Trump administration, but also, finding the right moments to obviously, low R resist, or, opportunities to sort of create momentum in our own communities. John, I wanted to stick with this theme of pro-worker policy because I feel like it's popping up sort of across the political divide, whether you're sort of in the progressive community or you're in the more conservative community. I know you guys have been doing a lot of research around workers. Would love for you to speak to that. You and I were able to really successfully work with the last Trump administration around opportunity zones. I think there's a big question about what that is. But I mean, so A, tell us a little bit about your research, but B, do you have any windows, for our audience about where there might be some opportunities to work with the incoming administration?
Yeah, I'll pick up where I left off. I think the worker mobility piece is a big one. I also think connecting more workers to the engine of economic growth that has made this the best place in the world and the envy of the world for so long is that's a big part of the frontier of pro-worker policy and a big area of potential bipartisan alignment. Something that we've been doing at EIG is looking at how do we build wealth in this country? How does the government actually encourage building wealth? It's two main ways. One is through home equity, and the other is through retirement savings. There's huge tax advantages applied to both of those. Retirement savings is actually the number one source of household wealth in this country. It far outpaces even home equity, and that was a surprise to me when I got into this project, looking at, okay, how do we connect more workers to that? So that first part is true, but it's also true at the same time that at any given time, 50+ million workers are not participating in the retirement system at all. They're not saving, they don't have access to retirement accounts, so they're missing out on that time to compound wealth and to build a secure future. And of course, doing that also gives you something to pass on to younger generations. And so you're not creating that positive intergenerational wealth cycle. That's a huge part of our workforce. Over 40% of the full-time workforce at any given time doesn't have workplace benefits, which means they're not saving, because that's how we save in this country. Which means that the incentives that we offer through the federal government are meaningless, right? Because if you don't have an account, you're not saving, then the incentives don't matter. So that's the kind of thing, something my organization's been working on for a few years to lay the groundwork. And President Trump's chief economist was one of the co-authors of our white paper to lay out that idea, along with somebody from the New School who is about as left-wing as you can get as an economist. And so that's an unlikely pairing, but I think it speaks to how this issue of pro-worker policy really is a jump ball. And if we think about how we connect more people to the engine of growth of our economy, how do we make more people stakeholders in the economy and give them a reason to care about growing markets and the health of the economy, that's a very positive opportunity and one that neither party has fully captured. I think we see that in our political system that voters do toggle back and forth quite a bit. And when they think about this election, the economy was at the top of their list of concerns. And you can imagine why. If you're one of those 50+ million who are thinking about retirement and thinking about how inflation affects you today, how it erodes your ability, your margin for error, when we surveyed this, we found that one of the only things that had not improved about people's personal financial circumstances or their view of that since the pandemic was their readiness for retirement. It's one of the highest anxiety areas in the wake of the COVID crisis was, hey, they feel like they're kind of back to normal on their job, they feel like they're back to normal on consumption, but The thing that fell out was their ability to put stuff away for retirement in the intervening years. So I think that's a real area of opportunity, and one where, again, it's not highly partisan. In fact, retirement policy has been traditionally very bipartisan. But you need some innovative ideas and some real organizing around what those ideas might look like to get people moving in that direction. I think that's an opportunity.
Super helpful. How's Heartland Forward, just thinking about I know you guys are a nonpartisan organization, but obviously you're reading the tea leaves, and how are you thinking about what you saw during the election, how that's sort of impacting the work that you guys are doing in community?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of unknowns. I mentioned broadband earlier, and a lot of states and communities have been waiting for about 3 years to get that $65 billion to build out the infrastructure so everyone has access to affordable high-speed internet. And then we still have, and it's not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue as well. And we still have folks, that need the digital skills. And let's make sure we use the funding not just to teach digital, like the basic digital skills, but AI as well. So those are things where we're, really watching and encouraging state policymakers to bring the conversation from the ground up, to encourage the Congress and the new administration to make sure we don't set those dollars aside. Those are dollars that are needed, and people have been left behind for quite some time. It's 2024. How do you do anything without the internet these days? And people are still without access. Just to build too on something that John said and work that we're doing in partnership, a lot of our sweet spot is smart public-private partnerships. So how can private dollars go in and help seed and test to then make things sustainable on the back end? And in the economy right now, and in even big business and industry, we're talking a lot about, companies are announcing they will hire people that do not necessarily have a 4-year degree, and that, not all students are going to go to a 4-year school. But what do we do? How are we educating students and about where their opportunity is post high school? And so that's something that we're really focused on, that will get and lead to where John is saying. But we've helped work with State Department of Education and private dollars to go in and put some advisors to work alongside high school counselors to really work one-on-one of, what are you thinking about post-high school? And an interesting story about it is, and why we have to come together as policymakers, is in the state of Arkansas, maternal health. Unfortunately, we have a big issue. But the education folks aren't talking to the health folks. But we have a student in Arkansas that's a junior in high school that came to her advisor and said, I want to be a nurse. I'm so excited to be a nurse, but I'm pregnant. And what do I do? Well, because the systems aren't talking to each other, it becomes very clunky to help this student get the thing she needs so she can have her family if she decides to do so, but then also she can have it start her training and education for nursing and careers. So those are the things that those are real things happening on the ground that we're trying to solve for. And we believe, especially at the state and local level, you can bring parties together and create those smart public-private partnerships to get things done.
Super helpful. I'm going to come back to you all on sort of, trends that New Deal leaders should be thinking about, and we'll do that before I go to the audience for questions. But Mayor, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about this pro-worker policy. I'm going to put a little bit of burden on you because I am actually going to ask you to talk a little bit about race and how it looks, because I feel like in the conversation sometimes when we start talking about pro-worker policy, it becomes all about white men. And I do think it's an important piece of it, but there's also lots of black workers, lots of brown workers, and I'm under the general belief that strong, inclusive economic policy lifts up all communities. And I just think, given where you sit, both obviously as a black leader, but obviously given how St. Louis is made up, you're probably thinking about how to lift all of those communities. Is that fair? And what would you add there?
Yeah, so that's why we started the Monarch. It's an old electrical facility, and it's 150,000 square feet. And so we're going to co-locate several city departments that people need in order to thrive. So our workforce development agencies go in there, our Office of Violence Prevention is going there, our Economic Empowerment Center, which we launched also with ARPA dollars, that focuses on entrepreneurship, either helping people start a business and giving them the tools and resources to do so, or if they want to expand it, and our MBE certification, which is important for contractors in order to get contracts, and our plan room. All of that is going in this facility to make sure that we're providing resources in community for people to thrive. And when I think about pro-worker policies, I'm thinking about those people who have typically been left behind and ignored. And we have ignored an entire swath of our city for almost 5 decades. Come to North St. Louis and you will see that in certain parts it looks like a bombed out war zone. You'll see entire blocks that have maybe 1 or 2 houses on the entire block and nothing but grass or overgrown brush or overgrown trees. And so we are slowly going block by block to change that. Also going in the Monarch is our LRA, or our land bank, and the tools that we need to keep up our property that we own through the city. The city owns 10,000 parcels. We are the largest landowner in the city. And so it's important for us to revamp our entire process of how we sell that property back, but also hold those private property owners accountable for the eyesores that they leave in our community as they try to speculate and hold on to buildings until that neighborhood comes back. So we're pushing back on them as well and saying, no, you can't do that. You cannot hold on to this piece of property and let it fall apart and look like trash. So we send them letters and we say, we need you to fix this, or we're going to fix it for you and send you the bill. And so we're doing all of this from this. Well, our goal is to do all of this from this one location, because we realize a lot of people don't want to come downtown to City Hall. It's intimidating, it's scary. So we're bringing resources in community to target those who have been left behind. Now, anybody is welcome, but we're being very intentional about putting this on Martin Luther King Boulevard. We're being very intentional to say to our community, we see you, we understand what you've been going through, and these are the resources we're bringing directly to you to help you improve your situation, to help you thrive, and to help you get out of what you've been going through over the past several decades.
Super helpful. So I'm going to give the panelists a chance to give us each of some of their amazing nuggets of wisdom, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So I just wanted to tee you up. So John, if you could... We have this amazing room of folks who are doing work on the ground, have an opportunity to sort of shape the economy over the next few years. What would you share with some highlights?
First thing in the morning, asking for an amazing nugget of wisdom is like that's a big ask. I mean, I would think, this is my bias speaking here, but I'm really drawn right now, and I think there's a lot of upside in focusing on things that are not what I would say litigating the premise of the economy. We have a free market capitalist economy, more or less. And I think right now is the time to think about how do we connect more people to the benefits of that system rather than litigating the premise of that system. A lot of what the mayor just talked about, who's being left behind, is a function of people. We know what the answer is, but I just talked about retirement policy. We know what helps people save. We know what tools work. Who has access to those tools? Thinking about that connectivity to proven things that build wealth, build financial security, build economic opportunity, and just widen the aperture of who is participating successfully in that system. I think there's a lot of upside there. That when I, as an organization, when we survey the economy and we survey economic challenges, so many of the biggest challenges all trace back to that same theme of we know what works, it's working for a lot of people, and then there's a segment of people, communities, workers, et cetera, who have been left out of that. They don't have the tools, they don't have the access. And those are some tremendous areas of opportunity for bipartisan policymaking, which can yield huge economic upside in just a single generation. And so I think that's really the last frontier and the primary frontier of this next era that we're going into. And it's going to come into play with things that you've talked about, AI and who's accessing the benefits of that, things like high-speed internet. So many things about the future of the economy require us to have a baseline where everybody has access to the same proven tools and everybody has an opportunity to thrive as a result. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Amazing nuggets from the heartland.
I would just say the time to move is now. There are great needs, and when we look across our states and communities, everyone wants a strong quality of life. And that means a lot of different things of how mayors implement policies in their cities, to how states allocate dollars to the communities and decide where funding is needed. I do think that there's a time to come together and really share those best practices and really kind of roll up your sleeves and get to know the communities maybe that haven't had the attention that they deserve. And not everything's going to be a one-size-fits-all. That's what's unique about the patchwork of our country and the amazing people that live within it. And so I think if we can keep that mindset as the time to move is now, and this is about the quality of life for people, and they want it. And so how do we make that happen?
From the mayor.
So there's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And so it's going to take everyone working together in order to get through these next several years. And that's public, private, philanthropic, civic, faith, everybody at the table. We've been able to pull together several coalitions around some of the issues that affect St. Louis the most. Crime and public safety is one. We have a regional crime effort that we've launched with everyone at the table on both sides of the river. We also just recently launched our pathway forward to end homelessness, again, bringing everybody to the table. We don't know what kind of support we're going to get from the administration, so we're going to have to, like my dad says, hunker down like a jackrabbit in a hailstorm. So that means hunkering down together, so bringing all of the people who care the most about your community to the table to fund and to find solutions to help us get through these next several years, because and it can't be on the shoulders of government alone is what I'm always pushing back at our community, saying, you can't just look at the city just to fix everything, because we didn't create it and we shouldn't be responsible for solving it. So how do we bring everyone who has a vested interest in making sure that our cities thrive to the table to solve some of these issues?
Thank you all. I think we have some time for some questions. Sir, over here.
Good morning. I'm Rob Werner, League of Conservation Voters, former elected. We haven't really touched too much on apprenticeships, which I think is really important as part of a solution. Not only traditional trades, but healthcare, energy, so forth. What comments do you have on really making greater investments in this country on apprenticeships?
Anyone want to take? Look like you want to.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's so important. I was just in Poplar Bluff, Missouri yesterday visiting the local Chamber of Commerce, the local school, high school, and the local college has come together to create a Grow Your Own Nursing Pathways program, and apprenticeships are part of that, working closely with the hospital. And I just saw firsthand, students today and people that are going into the workforce want to know what it's like. They want that access. They want to see it. And so it was so fun to see some of those nurses that were going through the apprenticeship program. And they're going to be, taking care of patients here in the next couple of weeks, and they're getting that real world experience. So then they can go in and figure out, how do I build my career in the financial success that they want for themselves and for their families. So I think it's great. I think we need to get business and industry, public-private partnerships, these things have to happen. I'm like you, the magic happens when you bring the right people around the table. And so we got to get more people understanding why it's a good thing and where dollars can flow and how we get people in that program.
Well, that's the whole reason why we built this facility in we call the hood in North St. Louis, right? Because our workforce development, or part of our workforce development agencies go in there, and they are experts in finding out where the jobs and opportunities are, and then matching up the people who come to us for services to those jobs and opportunities and apprenticeships. We have a program called Youth Build right now that takes people who didn't finish high school and connects them directly with the trades. So when they finish that program, they graduate, they finish their GED, and then they also have skills that they can go get good union jobs. And so we've had great success with the kids that we've put through that program. So, but that's why we're taking that out of downtown, out of City Hall, out of city government, and putting it directly into the community where people can feel more comfortable approaching that building for whatever workforce development needs that they have.
Other questions? Please.
Hi, Alex Kogan with the Center for American Progress, State and Local Government Affairs. We've been seeing a trend of counties and states looking into baby bonds as a way to bridge the wealth gap. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to perhaps the effectiveness of that, or what examples of success you've seen regarding baby bonds.
Well, I started a program as treasurer called the College Kids Children's Savings Account Program back in 2015. Our oldest cohort is in the 8th grade right now. We have over 20,000 children with over $2 million saved for their futures. We provide the first $50, and they can watch those accounts grow through good attendance, through match savings, and through parents' participation in financial education classes that we offer through our Office of Financial Empowerment, which provides free resources to help people make better choices with their money. So I thought it was important to open savings accounts because, at least for children, because it's a two-generation strategy. If that child has an account and the parent doesn't, 9 times out of 10, it sparks the parent to then open their own account, because we have parties at the credit union that holds all of our accounts. And so they're like, no, I need an account too if my child has an account. So teaching those lessons of financial empowerment, financial security as early as possible helps those families grow and thrive and make better financial choices. So it's not necessarily a baby bonds program, but that's our approach to addressing swaths of families who need financial empowerment resources.
Bravo. Do we have time for more questions? Got one or two? Yeah. Over there.
Hi, thank you all again for this exhilarating panel. I stand in the state, in terms of state of Ohio, where we're one of the only states in the country that don't give pay stubs to workers. We are a state that is seeing more families work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. And unfortunately, folks with degrees are leaving our state. As I think about what an inclusive economy looks like, I'm just trying to wrap my head around, what do you see are the policies of the future that we should be thinking about? I know we heard about baby bonds, and I know we heard about other things like direct investments, but as mayors and leaders at the city level, I'm just interested in hearing, what do you want from your state legislators that could help amplify building an inclusive economy that really touches the people directly, particularly those within some of the most marginalized communities?
One of the things I want for my state, but I know I'll never get, is basic income. We have a basic income pilot that we used ARPA funds to start, and then were sued and had to stop it, and then a generous philanthropist came forward and funded the rest of the program. So, but basic income is a floor, right? It's not a ceiling. And so as I've talked to families that are in this program, a lot of them are single black mothers. Over 70% of our participants is 540. Over 70% of the families are black female-led households. And they use the money to, it helps them breathe a little easier. There was one woman who was an Uber driver and also delivered, Uber Eats, and she had a 5-year-old at home. And this money allowed her to not work 14 hours a day delivering and driving people around, but cut it back to 8, like a normal person, right? And she's able to spend more time with her daughter, help her with her homework, help her with her schooling, have fun together. But our families are really suffering because of this gig economy that doesn't provide benefits, that doesn't provide the things that they need, retirement benefits or anything. So they're just kind of left out there wailing in order to make ends meet. So I really wish that we would lean in and do a basic income program. We did with the child tax credit that helped hundreds of thousands of families breathe, mine included, my little single parent home included. But getting back to the child tax credit or basic income, I think is a really pro-worker policy that would help families tremendously.
Good question about Ohio. I spent a lot of time thinking about Ohio for reasons we can talk about offline. The challenges of a state like Ohio, I would also, to your question about people leaving who have the choice to leave, the means to leave, how do we keep more of them? How do we make Ohio more competitive regionally? Two big things. One, I opened my comments today talking about worker mobility and non-compete agreements. Ohio is really bad on that issue. So if you have great skills, great marketability, which means you have great inherent mobility as a worker, why would you stay in a state like Ohio where you are more likely to be restricted by your employer as to what your future job options look like versus going somewhere else where you don't have those restrictions at a state level? This is a state policy that the states can take care of, make themselves much more competitive. When I talk to people in states like Ohio and they say, how do we build the next innovation economy? How do we build the next Silicon Valley? Which is really kind of the wrong goal, being, you need to build your own innovation economy in Ohio and forget about Silicon Valley. But what made Silicon Valley so great, in part, is because the state of California has never recognized non-compete agreements. So if you are a great entrepreneur with a great idea, you don't have to worry about retribution from your employer. You can go spin out, start your own company, or go work for a competitor who values your talents better. That's how you get the most out of your workforce. That's how you make yourself an attractive destination, and it's totally under the state's control. So that's one, and I think that's an area of bipartisanship. Two is housing. Got to build more housing, got to make it easier to build. This is another huge area of emerging agreement between the two parties. And there's a landing spot here for, at the state and the federal level, encouraging pro-supply, less onerous housing regulations that just allow people to build faster. Builders want to build. Buyers want to buy. This is not complicated. We haven't lost the ability to build houses, but we've made it incredibly complicated to do that. And places that are the most restrictive are going to lose people who have the choice to leave. That's just the reality. So those are two big areas of both bipartisanship and where states have a ton of control.
I would just add to, we haven't talked much on this, but I think state lawmakers have a huge opportunity to really push and put resources towards behavioral health. And it's so important. I mentioned that we have a Heartland Health Caucus that brings policymakers from both sides of the aisle together to talk about these issues. And we were in Nashville a couple of weeks ago, and they're really focused on where the dollar's going for behavioral health. And again, how are they working across agencies to make sure that we understand the challenges in individual states. So again, the Department of Education has a lot of intel, but how do we equip our teachers to work with students that have, that need the help so they can then get into the workforce? And so we all know it's an extremely important issue for our country, and I think state lawmakers have the opportunity to really drive some smart policy around that so we can get funding where it needs to go. I'll also say thank you to all of you that serve in office. As an organization, we're just here to be a resource, and we do a lot of education and share data. and resources. But, you know, I'm reminded of, I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma. My dad was the mayor. He was like, I'm really just a water, sewer, and trash guy because that's what you got to focus on. And it's hard because he wasn't paid and it's a part-time position. And our state lawmakers in the room, I get too, you have big issues in front of you, and you're run every 2 years for office. And, what do you do about AI? There's all these things. So one, thank you. And two, know that there's lots of people out there that are willing to provide just general support and information and data for all the issues that you work on each and every day.
I wanted to take moderator's prerogative and come back and ask a question, then I'll come back to the audience. But one of the pieces that I'd be interested in your insights on, I think we all look at the numbers, right? And, Mark Zandi, who many of you know is the chief economist at Moody's, was like tweeting before the election that this is the best economy that he's ever lived in his life. And I think we're all trying to square that with how folks feel. And a big piece of that feels like these policies that we're talking about often aren't showing up in place. And, when we think about the tax system, for example, we hear from families, it's not always super helpful to get a tax credit a year in advance. It would be much better if I could get something month to month for my financial stability. And I'm just wondering how you all are, from your perch, is thinking about how we help, modernize some of our institutions to show up in people's lives, in a more tangible way. And I think part of that is, roads and bridges are great, right? But they take 10 or 15 years, And the reality is we have a lot of technology. And so I'm just wondering how you all are thinking about that from where you sit. And so just any thoughts on that?
Sorry, ask your question again.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you think about how we help government better show up in people's lives. I think that is the most simple way in just feeling like because people feel like the government is so distant or not working, even though we have this technically macroeconomy that seems to be working really well from these large policies that were put in place, people aren't feeling that, right?
Right. So when I became mayor just 3.5 years ago, we were still using typewriters in some of our offices and triplicate paper. And so we made a really hard push to innovate and to develop new software systems. Or actually, we had already had the contracts in place with several software companies, and true to form, people just didn't want to convert and didn't want to just go ahead and take that leap. So we made a really strong push to innovate and to use the contracts we already had in place to improve our software and improve our processes. For example, our liquor license process, again, was mired in paper, and you had to get signatures of every person within a 350-foot radius in order just to get a liquor license for your restaurant. So we improved that process because small businesses are going to grow our economy, right? And especially with so many new Americans coming to St. Louis, we're actually one of the top cities that people are choosing. And we know that a lot of times they bring food and they want to open a restaurant and serve food, but part of that is having a liquor license. And so we took that platinum petition process out and instead have a conditional license that people can get so they can open quicker, they can serve liquor quicker, but also so their businesses can get into business in a quicker fashion. So, just some of those old relics we have tried to work through and cut some of the red tape for people who want to be entrepreneurs. And also, again, just trying to make sure that we're upgrading our software so we can respond faster in a myriad of ways.
Anything either of you wanted to add?
I would say, for most people, you don't want to be thinking about government at all. And when you are thinking about government, you're probably ticked off about how long it took to do something and the cumbersome kind of bureaucratic process that you've been subjected to. And so I think there's a real upside opportunity to be thinking about customer service and efficiency and just making things that people need to do or services that people want to have access to, much easier to access, much more straightforward, and a much more pleasant experience. And I think we've got this learned helplessness in this country that we should just accept that when you deal with the DMV, it's going to be terrible. When you deal with, that does not have to be the case. And I think for leaders who really lean into that and say, we're going to make it really easy and really enjoyable to interact. I remember customer service experiences that I've had with government that went well because they're so rare. And when they happen, it's like, this is amazing. And it would change my voting behavior. It's that big of a deal. So I think we want, if I'm giving advice to leaders, it's you want to be only on people's minds because you gave them a great experience and not because they have to come to you to remedy a bad experience.
Yeah, I would add to that. How do you remove the friction? Looking at policies, I mean, think about it. Before COVID, in the policy space, we've been talking about telehealth forever. Should it be allowed? Should it not be allowed? And then the COVID hit, and oh my gosh, telehealth was amazing, and now states have adopted it. There's other things that, if I live in a rural community, wouldn't it be amazing if my pharmacist could test and treat my child for strep throat so I don't have to drive 100 miles to get the medication so my child gets better? I mean, there's tons in the health space around licensing issues that are just, we need to modernize these policies so, a nurse can work across state lines and other employees can do the same. So there are still a lot of things out there that are probably what you might say low-hanging fruit that we could modernize really to help our families and communities.
Super helpful. I think we have time for one or two more questions before we do closing thoughts from our panel. Anything else from the audience? Quiet crowd. I can keep asking questions.
What city in the United States is doing this the best?
St. Louis, obviously.
Besides St.
yes.
Louis. And are there things to learn from somebody who's really doing this well?
That's an interesting question. Are there folks you all are watching?
Yeah, I think there's great places like Tulsa, Oklahoma that are really trying to rebuild their city, bring workforce to the area. There's some great places in North Carolina that are places to watch. I think the verdict is still out too. We say all the time, are people really moving from the coast to the middle of the country? What will that look like? I think some, and I'll speak just for the Heartland, while the Nashvilles and the Austins are amazing, when we're sitting down with economic development directors, we're saying, no, you be you, because, and learn from the rapid growth of those two communities, but you don't need to be the next Nashville and Austin. And I think some of the things, there's great things happening in Cincinnati, or places to watch, but I will say, all the places to watch are because of great leaders.
I would say personally, I watch Cincinnati, Cleveland. I think are two cities that are doing the right things and making those investments in the infrastructure, in the government infrastructure, in order to move their cities forward. Changing those old norms, those old policies, cutting the bureaucratic red tape to make it to make government easier to understand, easier to participate in, and easier to navigate.
And we haven't talked a ton about AI, and so I did want to ask a question about AI, but before I'm selfish, does anyone else have a question? Awesome. So I'm just wondering if any of you have how you all are thinking about sort of AI and the way that it's going to approach policy and sort of how you're thinking about tackling it from each of your different purviews.
We're being very cautious. Right now, we have, we're just using it, I would say, internally. And looking at other tools that we can use. Our IT director is fantastic and keeps his finger on the pulse of emerging technology, and he has worked with our staff to draft initial policy about the use of AI, especially in government, because that could be dangerous at times. So we're being very cautious, but still, keeping our eye on different tools that we can use.
We're in the education mode, so we've hosted a number of convenings with state lawmakers, business and industry entrepreneurs, really to get them talking. The first time around the table, the entrepreneur had no idea that the state of Tennessee, has already passed some legislation and a workforce planning on AI, and so we're just really getting people to be aware of what's happening. But it's really important. So a few stats. So between 2019 and 2023 at the state level, and you guys, I'm saying things that you all know, but between that time period of 19 and 23, there were 29 bills that were introduced around AI on a variety of different topics. So far, just this year, there's over 600 pieces of legislation across the country. So we got to educate ourselves, and then we've done some public opinion polling around people in the heartland, and interesting stats, again, a poll is a poll, but in the heartland, over 95% of people that we polled think it should be regulated. I have to tell you, if you ask that question on any issue about regulation, that is not what the number that comes back in the heartland. But then what's also interesting is 65% of the people that we polled think that their employer should teach them how to use AI. So there's some good things that we should think about, to your point, like let's be smart, let's not rush this from a policy perspective, but let's educate ourselves.
I'll offer two thoughts. One is when we asked workers in a big national survey recently if they think about emerging technology, and AI is kind of the most obvious one, whether they see that as a threat or an opportunity for their careers, overwhelmingly they said it's an opportunity. American workers are techno-optimists. They're not, in spite of all the fear-mongering I think that happens in the press, they're generally not scared of what technology is going to bring or how it's going to affect their jobs. But what's going to happen in AI over the next couple of years is going to be so transformative and going to happen so fast that I really worry that policymakers will be playing catch-up throughout that whole process. I think that's inevitable. So to end on a little bit of a downer, I think there's really not much to do to get ahead of the technological frontier here. And I would say, zooming all the way out, we want to make sure that that frontier happens primarily in this country, and that's the first order priority because of the implications down the road for national security. So.
Great. We're bumping up against time, but I just interview any closing thoughts, anything you want to leave you didn't get to share.
When we talk about this inclusive economy, just make sure that you notice who's not at the table and try to bring them there. That's what an inclusive economy is. A lot of times I look around at, especially in my table in the mayor's office, and try to see who's not represented, and try to see what their needs are and see if you have the resources or the capacity to meet them. Because it's going to take all of us in order to get through these next few years, but it's also, this is going to happen on the local level. Our local economies are going to be driving the innovation and driving inclusiveness for many, many years to come.
I'd say ditto.
I'll just use my time to say thank you and kudos to Debbie and this whole group. This is an amazing organization. I've had the privilege of knowing you guys for a while. One of the best organizations in the country. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the network that you guys have to do great policymaking together across the country in this upcoming 2 years, and I'm really excited to see what you guys are up to.
Absolutely. Well, it takes leaders of all forms, so please join me in thanking these 3 amazing leaders on stage.
All right, well, thank you, Rhett, and to all of our panelists for a great conversation. Now we are going to dig in deeper on an issue that is central to this economic conversation, which is one that was also, of course, a big part of the campaigns this year, but has long been one of the most popular topics at our New Deal conferences, and that is, of course, housing affordability. The panel will be led by longtime New Deal leader, former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Moreau Weinberger. He is now the visiting fellow at the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. Joining him are Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall, Laura Arce, Senior Vice President of Economic Initiatives at Unidos US, which is the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights advocacy organization. And we have Sarah Bronin, who leads the National Zoning Atlas, which is digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing information about zoning in the United States. So join me in welcoming Moreau and the rest of the panel. Sure.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you and be able to be part of this panel. I'm going to kick things off with just some sort of overarching remarks, and then we've got this awesome panel that's going to take on different aspects of this housing challenge. I wanted to echo where the last panel finished and thank Jonathan, Helen, Debbie, really the entire New Deal team for putting on another great annual conference. I think this is the 13th annual conference I've come to, and it has just been awesome to see these events getting bigger and better through the years. And I am particularly heartened to see the focus that housing has been this year, really a major theme of the past 2 days. In addition to this panel, yesterday there was a great permitting reform breakout group. If you didn't get a chance to see it, you can check out the materials from it. There's some great ideas there. And, but also when we heard from Secretary Pete that our work should be all about everyday issues, there is no issue that defines everyday life and affordability more than the cost and the quality of your home. When Jennifer Polka at the end of the day raised the alarm and says we can't be the party of government if government doesn't work, she's talking about housing too, as there really is no area where government is failing more right now than with housing. How bad is that failure? Here are a few of the metrics that jump out to me. Some projections say we are 7 million homes as a country short of where we need to be, and that has driven homeownership just out of reach for big swaths of the country in ways that they're angry about, and it has caused an unprecedented number of Americans to have to spend more than half of their income on rent. It's even worse for the 650,000 Americans now that are homeless, a record number. But it's not just that, right? Like the housing shortfall impacts so many of our other social and economic challenges as well. One example from my home state of Vermont, we've had rising healthcare costs, soaring healthcare costs for many years now. It's gotten so bad that we're having an active conversation about near-term dramatic service cuts across the state. The state put out a big report this past summer saying, how do we fix the healthcare crisis? Their number one transformational recommendation, build a lot more homes, because right now nurses and other critical healthcare workers just simply don't have a place to live. A last indication, one I think that has been very much on our minds through these 2 days of our failure to build enough homes is in the election results themselves. The biggest red shifts, heard this on Ezra Klein this morning, I hadn't quite known this before. The biggest red shifts took place in blue cities and in blue cities in blue states, which generally speaking are also the areas where our housing costs and housing pressures are highest. Klein and Matt Iglesias, who we heard from yesterday, and other journalism has made it pretty clear that Democratic policies on housing, unintentionally, but much more so than in Republican policies, have made our cities and states that our party runs shockingly unaffordable because of a complex web of state and local laws and ordinances that have made it way too hard to build homes, which is fundamentally the problem. That is what is driving this crisis. We've made it too hard to build. To her great credit, Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, understood this and spoke far more about creating housing than any presidential candidate ever has. But fixing this problem, building a lot more homes of all types for all income levels, is not something that can be solved by presidential speeches alone. This is a problem that has grown law by law, ordinance by ordinance for decades, and it is going to take years of sustained policy and implementation work to turn it around. New Deal leaders, in many cases, are, as you're going to hear, and should be leading this work. The pro-growth, progressive values that this organization has stood for since the very start are exactly what's needed to fix this problem and restore the Democratic brand with respect to housing. We need to fix the housing market that our policies have broken, and we need to grow and build our way out of this housing shortage. I'm just going to take a couple minutes more to describe what I see as the guiding principles of that work, and then we'll get into other ways to approach it with my colleagues here. As Jonathan noted, I spent 15 years as a housing developer before becoming mayor, and I learned the hard way during that time just how hard it was to build, including, one big example that always stuck out with me. We had one project that a single neighbor essentially single-handedly held up for a decade that kept us from bringing onto the market 25 much-needed homes. When I became mayor, I knew we had to fix this, and that was one of my top priorities throughout the 12 years that I was in office, and we did have significant successes. The numbers are going to sound small compared to what Aaron and I think others have done, but Burlington's a small place. We're only 45,000 people. We got more than 2,000 homes either completed or constructed during my time in office, which was about a 400% increase in housing production over prior decades. Thank you. The principles of that work, I think there's really four principles to me that kind of have broader application. One is we have to end that veto-ocracy that allowed that one neighbor to block a project for a decade. It exists in many other areas, and we're never going to get where we need to be if we can have one abutter stop a project for that length of time. This is going to be difficult for us to do as a party because we have long advocated for more public engagement and more public process, but we have to be smarter about how we do this. Big theme of the perma reform group yesterday is that the public engagement needs to come when discretionary decisions are being made about housing policy, when that policy is being set, not on a project by project basis as so often is how it works now. We need to reduce housing costs wherever we can. Low-hanging fruit like eliminating wasteful parking requirements, which Burlington and now hundreds of other cities have done, is one way to get right at that. Getting rid of redundant permitting requirements. We actually, in Vermont, we have a state and a local land use law. It's got to end. But it's also going to take the difficult, sustained kind of tending of our garden, of our land use policies, if you will, like Jennifer Palka argued yesterday. I'd urge everyone in the room, no matter what your role, to lean into the housing abundance movement in one way or another. It's really one of the most positive things happening in the country right now, I believe. We got done in my final city council meeting just last spring. We passed a neighborhood code that essentially legalizes 2 structures on every lot in Burlington, and each structure can have up to 4 units. There is no way that we would have gotten such a pro-housing policy done were it not for this grassroots Vermonters for people-oriented places that sprung up in my last few years in office. 20 and 30-something young folks coming out and making it very clear that when opponents were arguing about nuisance issues like shadows and maybe a little more traffic, the trade-off to that was them being able to find a home and grow a life in Burlington. This is a movement that is growing. There are now, I think, 7 states that have statewide professionalized housing abundance movements. One of the things I'm trying to do right now is create a new group in Vermont that advocates for pro-housing policies at the state and the local level. Still, there's not nearly enough people doing this nationwide. There's only about 80 folks who sort of get paid to lobby on pro-housing work day to day. You compare that to like climate politics where there's probably more than 5,000 folks. This is an area we need all sorts of energy and investment. And then finally, I think that to some degree, mayors and state officials have to think of themselves and really become developers in a way. What do I mean about that? I mean, I know that's antithetical to a lot of folks. Whenever we see a villain in a movie about a city, the villain is usually either a developer or a mayor. I've been both. That actually is a function of how bad our policies are, that bribery and corruption is how a lot gets built. when I look back on the 2,000 homes that we created in Burlington, a bunch of them came from the land use reforms I've sort of touched on here, but more than half of them came from the city being an active partner in a major project. The city building millions of dollars of infrastructure using tax increment financing or other tools, the city swapping land. It was hard work. It took, we had to negotiate long agreements and renegotiate them and over. We had to build that capacity in a city that really had lost it. I think a lot of cities have done that. It's time. Many places need to get back to their roots of cities being growth machines if this is going to work. All right. So with that, those are my thoughts. I'm excited to hear from our other panelists now. Erin, you want to kick us off and describe the remarkable successes you've had in Salt Lake?
I think you've had remarkable success with over 400%. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. But it's not doubling the number of homes in the downtown like you've done, as I understand it.
Salt Lake City is in an amazing spot right now. I'm Erin. If I haven't met you yet, I want to. It's my first New Deal in DC, and I am really a nerd about cities. I love being a mayor. It was never in my plan. And the cool part is you get to do things that impact your backyard and your kids' teachers' backyards and front yards. And I love this work. I was born in a double-wide trailer in Arizona, and parents were immigrants, refugee immigrants, and my dad's family goes way back. So the experience of being in this role right now and getting to build housing is just an American dream in and of itself. In Salt Lake City, we're in the fastest growing state in the nation. Utah has led population growth since 2010. We've had about 24% population growth. Our downtown core grew through the pandemic. Doesn't mean we didn't lose some businesses, but our downtown population since 2020 will have doubled by first quarter next year. And we're looking at about 10,000 more units coming online in the years following that. So we added a NHL team. They just started in October. We just got the Olympics re-awarded to us in July. They'll be coming back in 2034, the Winter Olympics and Paralympics. And so we're in a great horizon for investment, and there's a lot of investment happening. That's part of the lens through which I get to say that the city has increased our rate of investment just about over 400% also. We put a portion of our sales tax, and we collect 10% of all of our tax increment deals across the city. The first 10% goes into affordable housing creation. So since 2020, we've invested about $120 million in the creation of, and in some cases, the preservation of affordable housing in our city. And that's totaled almost 6,500 units since 2020. But of course, it's the really deeply affordable housing, 30% AMI and lower, that is the most difficult to produce. We also, as a growing city, have an on-street homeless population because we don't have enough shelter beds open. We didn't build the permanent supportive and transitional housing that the Homeless Shelter Services Plan called for, the we being the entire state of Utah. And this is a problem that affects our Salt Lakers at an increasing rate. So more than half of Salt Lakers are now renters. That's the highest that we've ever had in our history. And of those renters, over half of them are cost burdened. So they're paying more than 30% of their income for their household costs. In addition to that, like a lot of capital cities and larger cities, we're a medium-sized city at 200,000. Families have been moving out for decades. And I believe really firmly that if you, as a mayor, for those of you who are mayors, are not incredibly focused from zoning, economic development, and the tools that you have to create housing, that families are going to be pushed out by the market naturally. The market is not being built for families, and downtowns are not being built for families. But when I go to a rad downtown, it's one that has kids walking to school through the central business district. It's a place where families are hanging out after 5 o'clock because they live there and they're at the park together. That's the kind of a future downtown that I feel like we need to focus on and make happen. So part of our focus has been in putting greater incentives toward family-sized units and trying to remove some of the barriers that exist in our zoning and our economic development strategies that haven't let childcare facilities exist in the downtown as much.
Yeah, I hope we get to come back to that in the questions, and that I think that's really unusual from what I've heard about where a lot of the housing market is going, those larger units. So hearing how you did that in Salt Lake in more detail would be great. But first, let's go to Sarah Bronin. Welcome, Sarah. Excited to hear about your zoning atlas work and more.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I am the wife of a mayor here, Luke Bronin. So I dedicate all of my remarks to him. Just kidding. Or yes, I do, actually. And I was really lucky for 7 years to serve as chair of the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, appointed by his predecessor, and really dig into the city's zoning code. I'm a law professor at Cornell, and I do lead this project called the National Zoning Atlas. And I wanted to pick up on one of the things that our mayor from Salt Lake City just said, and to say that zoning is a really important factor in housing. And it's not just, I think you've underscored this point in your remarks, it's not just whether the housing can be built, but it's also all of the other things that are happening in and around the area where housing is. So whether it's a central business district, whether it's shops that people can walk to, creating whole communities, whole neighborhoods through zoning is really important. So I've dedicated I guess right now, my career to helping people understand what zoning is and how it works in their lives, both with regard to housing, but also with regard to everything else. So right now I'm doing that in two ways. First is actually a book that just came out a few weeks ago, and it is called Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World. And actually, our moderator is in the book. So I wanted to present you with a copy of it. And he's actually in the book for something other than housing creation. Burlington has pioneered some innovative ideas about streets as well as parking. And so the provisions that I call out in the Burlington approach really actually do relate to that whole community approach. But the second way that I've really tried to illustrate how zoning works in our world is through this project called the National Zoning Atlas. So how many people here have read cover to cover your zoning code? Okay, I see like 3. So we have read cover to cover the zoning codes of over 5,000 communities across the country, 550,000 pages of zoning codes, and we have put information up to an interactive online map at zoningatlas.org/atlas is where you get right to the map. And we have 8 states that are up on the map already, before I forget. Connecticut, the first state that we put up, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Arizona, Nevada, and Massachusetts. We do have Shelby County up on the map, Mayor Harris. We have all of Salt Lake County up on the map. We're finishing Colorado, California, New Mexico, and we've made significant headway in Montana, 800 communities in Texas, 300 in North Carolina and Ohio each. I'm just rattling off that list because I know we have huge diversity here in terms of representation, and that many of you work at the local levels. What our map does is it basically allows apples to apples comparisons. So incidentally, we do have Burlington up on the map and we have Salt Lake City up on the map. Given what Mayor Mendenhall just discussed, you would not be surprised to know that Salt Lake City allows 97% of land in the city, it allows housing to be built as of right. The only other city that I know comes close is Hartford, where we eliminated all public hearings, something that Moreau talked about in his remarks, being, I think, one of the biggest barriers to housing production. In taking that approach, in eliminating public hearings and allowing housing to move forward as of right, you've unlocked a huge amount of housing, and Hartford is on its way to doing the same, we hope. So just to kind of add a few more things that we cover in the map and that I cover in the book in a more storytelling kind of way. Minimum parking requirements, these what I have called in my research zoning by 1,000 cuts. all of these really technical terms, setbacks, height caps, minimum parking requirements, lot coverage requirements, minimum unit sizes. I know we have a state senator from Connecticut in the room. People were surprised to learn that one of our wealthiest towns in Connecticut required 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment and required every apartment that would be built in that community to be 2,000 square feet. Okay, so 2,000 square foot studio apartment with 3 parking spaces. Those are the kinds of provisions that we are finding in zoning code after zoning code around the country that prohibit housing. And by the way, it's not just what's happening in Memphis, it's not just what's happening in New Orleans, it's not just what's happening in Salt Lake City, but it's also what's happening in the surrounding metros. So we're also finding huge discrepancies between the housing permitted in the central cities and the housing permitted in the suburbs, and minimum lot sizes that cause environmental degradation, sprawl, stormwater runoff, and more. So I encourage you to look at the resource. It's free. You can click on your jurisdiction and it'll calculate the amount of housing, the amount of land that can be devoted to housing in the jurisdiction. And in about a week, we will have downloadable snapshots for every jurisdiction we have up. So I think that's all I needed to say, right?
That was awesome. That was great. I'm excited to dig into the atlas more and the book. Laura, welcome. We're very excited that Unidos US is here and participating, and excited about your housing and homeownership initiative.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I'm also very excited to take a look at the atlas. It sounds like a really great project and will help a lot of us who are working at the local level. So good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here representing Unidos US. My name is Laura Arson. I'm our Senior Vice President for Economic Initiatives, and I lead something we call the Home Ownership Means Equity Initiative, the HOME Initiative. And the focus of this initiative is to narrow and ultimately close the Latino homeownership gap. And we have an interim goal of helping to create 4 million new Latino homeowners nationwide this decade. And I would maybe step a little bit back in case, maybe not everyone is familiar with my organization. Unidos US is the country's oldest Latino civil rights organization. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and we also have offices in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. So in general, we work at the federal level and nationwide, but we do have some state level, local level work in those states. We're a civil rights organization, so I would say that's kind of the North Star of the work that we do, but we are a cross-issue organization. So I have colleagues who focus on workforce, health, education, and of course the housing space is where I focus my time. Our organization, we've long have worked on housing matters, whether on the program side or the public policy side. And I would say that in particular, we have focused within housing, because housing is a big thing. We tend to focus mostly on the home ownership side. And that's for several reasons. I mean, housing is important across the spectrum, but for home ownership, we focus on it for a few reasons. I think historically, a lot of what we would talk about is about the representation of home ownership being that gateway to the middle class, to building generational wealth, and it's something that is often cited as a big priority when we do polling and surveys of the Latino community. But I think, the more, especially in recent years, the more housing has been elevated in the broader public policy discussion. We recognize things like, now we understand that your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcomes than your DNA code. We also know that your zip code is the best predictor we have in the US of your social mobility and what opportunities you have. So clearly where you live really matters. And within that, home ownership, that added representation of family and security and stability is really key and important. And so that's why we focus on that space. And maybe, one kind of last theme I'll touch on before, for kind of in my introduction is, historically, Unidos, the work we've done around advancing homeownership has been focused on things like policy and advocacy around, fighting lending discrimination and fair housing programs, as well as on the more programmatic side of helping first-time home buyers through education and counseling and education. And all those things remain very important, and they're certainly continue to be part of the work that we do. But in the last few years, it's become clearer and clearer that housing supply and availability and affordability are really our top barriers. And so like right now, if someone were to ask me, like, what is the number one barrier to closing the Latino homeownership gap? I would say housing supply. We're not building housing, enough houses, particularly across different income spectrums for different sizes and types of families, different types of workers. And so, sometimes when I go to certain housing conferences, people will sometimes scratch their heads like, why is Unidos here? And it's, in short, I think housing supply is a civil rights issue. And that's why we focus on it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. You can dive into a lot more, but a little bit about who we are and why we care about this work.
That's great, Laura. That's great to hear that a civil rights organization identifies supply in that way, and I think it represents really the mindset shift that we're talking about here. That's really going to be needed. I don't think there were many spaces a few years ago where kind of progressive folks were sitting around talking about how to achieve progressive goals through expanding housing supply, but that there's suddenly been this broad realization of it is really encouraging. So we want to get to questions from all of you in a moment. I guess I can't help but one follow-up. Aaron, can you say a little bit more about how you have used the zoning ordinance to encourage 3 and 4 bedroom units? It's definitely a challenge I always found is like builders, even if we had somehow encouraged that through the zoning ordinance, I always sort of got pushback even from affordable housing builders about building that type of unit for various sort of financing reasons. So tell us more how you've done that.
Money.
Yeah.
Yeah. The zoning, we have form-based code adoption in a lot of parts of our city. So we do not do it through zoning at all.
Okay.
We're going to give you more money as a developer. We're going to give you a lower interest rate on a loan that we give you. Typically, it's less than 10% of their total capital stack, but it's significant. And so it's through the financing that we're able to incentivize the creation of those family-sized units more. But if there are zoning ways, I think, I'm sure Sarah could tell us how we could do it and maybe double our efforts through better zoning on it. But money's the big deal.
All right, that's great. Let's go to the questions. Welcome.
Hi, Amir Faroki, Atlanta City Council. I represent the densest part of the state, so I've a community that's very comfortable with density, but I have lots of scars from zoning battles. I don't view this as a partisan issue, but to the extent it is, I think there's zoning issues and school redistricting issues are like the 2 categories where I think liberals and progressive lose their liberal values. And I'm curious, so much of our orientation on these conversations have been, how do we make progress as center-left Democrats vis-a-vis oftentimes Republican opposition or framing. But on this issue, I think oftentimes the challenge is not Republicans, it's really kind of affluent, oftentimes liberals who live in center cities who are uncomfortable with more density or expanded density. And I'm curious how, maybe Mayor Mendenhall, but all of you have insight into this, kind of where there's opportunity to make progress with getting folks to think about the issue through the new neighbors, right? Or not pulling up the drawbridge behind you. Okay, you've benefited from being here. So that making these policy changes is, it's always going to be pitched, but that we can make more progress in finding ways to build more housing for folks.
Yeah, thank you. I was on the city council for 6 years, and Miro, we have some things in common. My last council meeting, sort of the gift, I call it a gift that my council gave me was we finally voted on accessory dwelling units. And it had been stuck in the city council for 9 years because the more affluent areas of the city, their representatives were pushing back and saying, just put it basically in the lower income areas in the central city. But the whole approach is about geographic equity in access to housing types and affordability. And just as an aside, I think there's an interesting outcome of opportunity zones, at least it's played out in our city, where it helped to reconcentrate affordability in our neighborhoods of historic poverty, where we've been trying to pull affordability options out of those neighborhoods and distribute them more. The way we got the accessory dwelling units passed, we should have called it mother-in-laws. Think about if we called it the cabana ordinance. Like, you're already convincing a few more people that this is a good thing, but we call it ADUs. So I think the tipping point became the seniors in the district. I represented a wide district that crossed the city longitudinally, and older residents who were on their fixed incomes, retirement, been in my house for 25 years, and the taxes are going up such that I can't afford to live here anymore, and this is not what I want. And that conversation about having access of all ages, people who help build our neighborhoods to be able to stay in our neighborhoods longer, giving my neighbor the opportunity to decide who they want to live in the ADU that they've built with the equity they've earned in their home, who's maybe going to help them shovel a sidewalk and keep an eye on the house with them. So it became an argument about preserving the access to housing for our older population, which was not an approach that the city had taken before. And it really was those kind of East Bench residents who raised their voices, who have easier access to raising their voices, but tip the scale to get accessory dwelling units across the city. And now we funded a library of accessory dwelling unit plans, because people who own their own house are usually not developers, and this can be really intimidating. So we have a library of approved plans that residents can use that fit in most of our lots.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, that one of the other things that I did after stepping down from the city's Planning and Zoning Commission was I started a group called Desegregate Connecticut that was essentially a zoning reform group. Obviously, in the name, we were harnessing a social justice movement and a push forward in that direction. And we actually did polling, so we picked our name and then we did polling about statewide zoning reform and different messages that would resonate. And we found that an economic message, an environmental message, and then third, but close, an equity message were part of that. We did videos that showed people, this was right at the beginning of COVID, we did an accessory dwelling unit video with a woman who was a nurse who didn't want to live with her older parents in the same unit. And so, it was kind of trying to tell those stories. But I'm convinced, even though we did pass some statewide zoning reform in Connecticut a year after we were founded, I'm convinced that it's the economic argument that Democrats need to make for zoning reform. So going back to the affordability, I need an accessory dwelling unit so I can stay in my home, but thinking much more regionally about the provision of housing supply, it is an economic argument. You're spending more on social services when you don't have enough housing. People are unable to contribute to the economy. And by the way, in Atlanta, which we are going to start, I think next month, there's 167 metros in the CBSA, I think. So we're heading to Atlanta, our team, very soon. We've collected all the zoning codes. But using Atlanta as an example, I'll predict that what we see is large lot sizes outside of the central city, outside of your district. And that is actually extremely costly for local governments because they have to repave those roads. There's a utility cost. You can get 100 units in a 2-acre minimum lot size subdivision, or you can get 100 units in a single building. And so I think over time we are seeing municipal governments, county governments saying, how are we going to maintain all of this? There's not enough new development to maintain it. I think the fiscal argument for better zoning is going to be the winning argument, and I think Democrats should make that argument.
Can I jump into, I love this question because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially in the last couple of weeks. And I agree with everything you've said. I think about the messaging is so important in knowing your audience and where you are. So all of you know best your local communities, the state you work in terms of which of these messages is going to work. And I think about, like all the reforms that have passed in the last number of years in California, And then a lot of very similar policies around ADUs and all that passing in Montana. And I think about, Montana's, their cry was "Don't California my Montana." But ironically, they were passing, some policies that were very much, model on some of the things California had done. And part of that was thinking about, in some places you talk about inclusionary zoning, in other places you talk about property rights. And so just again, knowing your audience. And the last, maybe one other, theme or message to kind of put in your arsenal, depending on where you are, that we deployed with our state director in some communities in California is, a lot of this, this local zoning battles, NIMBYs, it's like, us versus them and the newcomers and the outsiders. And so we try to flip it, and it's like, this isn't about, other people coming from who knows where. This is about your kids who went to college and now want to move back home and raise their grandkids near their family, and they can't afford to. So making this about, it's not about some other person out there you don't know, but it's about your kids, your grandkids, your extended family being able to live nearby. I know for me, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I grew up in a community where all my grandparents, my cousins, we all lived near each other. We used to see each other every Sunday, and now we're all dispersed, different parts of California and across the country, because it just got too expensive. And we've lost that family center that I think a lot of people are still trying to preserve. And so that's another theme that I think in some places works.
That's great. I'll give you just one last answer quickly on this. Old-fashioned sort of political organizing and coalition building really works as well. Again and again, we had seniors groups and active transportation groups, and we had a group called Vermont Professionals of Color. We had this VPOP group at the end that really was a youth group, AARP, of course, the business community and the affordable housing community and commercial builders. That kind of coalition is very powerful if it's coming out and speaking with a consistent voice. Kind of Oregon has had that, defending the urban growth boundary, pioneering legislation for 50 years. And it's really, fundamentally, that's why this housing abundance movement, I think, is so important, is it kind of creates a permanent coalition to come out day in, day out, year after year to move this work forward. Okay, welcome.
Good morning. My name's Shepard Kalantari Johnson, and I'm a Santa Cruz, California City Council member. I really appreciate this conversation. Just for some context, you just mentioned California has passed a number of laws. So local control at the city level has been taken away, I think, for the right reasons. We weren't building. Santa Cruz was among 6% of the state that met our regional housing allocation goals. And we were just given the pro-housing designation. So we're very proud of that. We've been building. We weren't building for too long, and now we're building. My question goes to, how do we keep up with the systems and infrastructures that are needed? And one specific example, you mentioned the laws around parking. So California has also passed state law that does not require parking if you live within a certain distance from a major transit district. So now we get these housing projects that offer zero parking for 200 units, and of course the community's freaking out, and I think for right reason, because our metro bus system, I sit on that board, we're trying, but we're not there. We don't have the transportation system to provide the alternatives to driving your own car. So that's just one example, but I'd love your thoughts on how do we keep up with the other infrastructure needs as we're growing and building. And again, for context, we're a city of about 65,000, so.
Shebra, that's a big question. There's probably a lot of good answers, and I'm going to just offer one idea. We have a housing developer called Give Group, and they may be doing other projects, but the innovative part of some of their projects is this shared car system. So they have they have a couple or maybe a few electric cars that live as part of the tenant access agreement. So you as a tenant can, Salt Lake City is one of the few places in the state of Utah where you can really live without a car if you want to. I don't know that works in Santa Cruz, but through targeting the city's incentives, as limited as and precious as your tax dollars are, to figuring out if you can't yet keep up with the infrastructure impacts that are tremendous and are probably going to be decades of delay. How can you start to incentivize more creative parking solution? We also started funding, sort of a separate issue, but we started funding school bus passes for every public school student in Salt Lake City. Our school district is a separate entity, but they had some money and never enough. So for 3 years now, we've had every public school student with a bus pass, and this year we added one parent per student household. All the educators also. Bus use has skyrocketed. The cool part, like Tashara was saying, it's like double when you can get two things out of it here. We're teaching future transit riders because these kids are not afraid anymore to get on the bus. They know how to use the system, and it helps with our air quality issues. So that was a relatively small investment for the city compared to what it would have cost us to get our transit provider to put more buses into every neighborhood. So maybe some creativity around transportation.
I'll just add that one of the things I try to, the cases I try to make about zoning in my book and in my speaking and work is that zoning is the way that state legislatures have written zoning enabling acts. Local governments have pretty, I mean, even in California, local governments still have pretty broad powers to use zoning to shape behavior. And I think this shared parking example is a really good one. Things the parking minimums, when instead of those, some cities, including Hartford, have set parking maximums in addition to that, set out bike parking infrastructure, so covered bike parking, showers and changing facilities in workplaces. So I do think that the power of zoning to actually reshape behavior and force the cost of building some different types of infrastructure on property owners and on developers is an, I think, under-tapped resource. And I will point out that from the parking side, what we did in having parking requirements where they still exist, and they still unfortunately do exist in basically everywhere except for leading cities, is that we force developers to subsidize the cost of car infrastructure. So to the tune of billions of dollars, a year maybe even in real estate investment, we tell developers you have to go out and build structured garages, parking spaces. And when you do that, you reduce the amount of land on an individual lot that can be developed for housing. So we already had this infrastructure subsidy that we were forcing on developers. We can maybe have some less onerous subsidies that have benefits to the community that can integrate with the transit system. So, yeah, I agree.
One thing I'd just add is that new developments, new housing does have the potential to create an enormous amount of new public revenues that can be used to handle some of these infrastructure needs. I'm not a huge fan of putting too much of it into parking infrastructure, although sometimes that's necessary. There are all sorts of things. I think it's actually pretty exciting how transportation has changed and all these emerging, essentially, technologies that can help with a car light lifestyle. Like we have a nonprofit car share in Burlington that's quite successful, kind of like a Zipcar for-profit model in other cities. It's become, I think, almost ubiquitous now, but Uber and Lyft go a long way to making a car light lifestyle possible. Okay, so, great. All right. We'll try to be quick in our response. Go ahead.
Hey, Caleb Hemmer is a state house member in Tennessee. So I learned an important lesson last year. I passed an affordable housing bill, and it was mostly bipartisan, but one of my colleagues voted against it, and I went over and asked him why afterward, and he said, when you say affordable housing, my constituents think it means Section 8 housing. And so to try to message better into, attainable housing, workforce housing, et cetera. So I guess and also I would say our state, just really hasn't done anything. They kind of viewed affordable housing as a local issue, not a state issue, and so we're kind of, actually starting to think about it as a state issue. So my question is for folks like me in more conservative states or haven't done a lot from a state level policy around affordable housing, what are some of those policies that are working we should start looking at, and how should we message around that?
So we work with the Beacon Center in Tennessee, and they've helped us do both the Nashville and Memphis areas in the zoning atlas, which I think they are now hopefully taking to the state legislature and starting to use data to inform those conversations. what we just talked about on Montana, we also saw the Frontier Institute make that property rights argument. They used data from the Montana Zoning Atlas to make it, and then these reforms were dubbed the Montana Miracle. I think looking to Montana would be a really good way to kind of develop a playbook and how to talk about housing options. I usually say housing options, just to, diverse, or maybe not diverse, but a variety of housing options is what I typically say. I'm from Texas. I'm actually from Houston, the only major American city without zoning. And so I'm kind of, I hear that sort of, in the background of my mind. What would somebody in Texas think about this? So I would say look to Montana, look at how they messaged, and see if you can pull from that. But in terms of affordability, I usually just talk about options.
I'll take the approach of defining what affordability looks like. And I think it's probably true that most of us have needed affordable housing at some point in our lives or will need it in the future. And in Utah, supermajority Republican legislature, very conservative, blue dot city. Since 2005, incomes have increased, the median income 19%. Our rent costs have increased 38%, and housing values have increased 83%. So most people in the state of Utah, 70% of Utahns can't afford the median-priced house. And you'd think if it's median, then maybe half of them could, but we can't. So when we talk about our kids who are maybe in college right now, or they're starting to have a family, we want to live by them. And as we did some research, a statewide entity did some research, the value ladder, when you get where we get the closest together on the political spectrum is wanting our families to be near us, at least to have the option to be near us, whether that's your aging parents or your kids when they're starting their own families. Talking about the income spectrum that we experience across a lifetime, and as Utahns we're experiencing intensely in the housing inaccessibility, can help to kind of normalize, but that's a long conversation. Our governor talks about our firefighters and our teachers, and yes, we should, they need more support, but right now they need housing that they can afford.
The state legislature in Utah also laid out a series of options for communities to adopt in zoning. So what they did at the state legislature level was they said, okay, if you want local control, here's a dozen things you can pick from and integrate into your zoning code. That may be another approach that's worth looking at.
Great. I think we have another question over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much for all your talk on this. I think we've probably all worked on stuff like this. I was a city councilor and passed zoning changes in my second to last meeting of my first term, allowing residential floors above our single-story commercial plazas throughout the city. And then on the state level, I've worked on our Housing Champions program, which I got up and running last year, which provides low-interest loans to housing-friendly communities, so you can take different actions, some of which is providing public water and sewer to new areas of town to support zoning. One question that I have is the balance of state and local power always comes up, and how you can kind of supersede or not local powers. And we've tried to redefine this conversation by calling it a partnership, by providing state-level tools like model ordinances, but what do you see working out there? Like, is it places where the states have kind of stepped in and put best practices out there? Is it the Montana approach where we pick from a menu of 5 out of 16 items, or is it California model where there's kind of mandates, or is it like encouraging through these incentives? Because New Hampshire has not much will for the first two options. So I just would welcome some data or anecdotes about what's been most successful.
I'm going to add that maybe it was a follow-up to the last one, that in the state of Utah, they did make the menu available. They required cities to come up with their moderate income housing plan. And in fact, I think that Sarah's research maybe 10 years ago would have shown that across the state of Utah, there were cities that didn't contemplate affordable housing opportunities in any zoning. In other words, it was impossible in some cases to create affordable housing in some parts of the state of Utah. So the state legislature said, not only are you going to come up with a moderate income housing plan, but if you don't, we're not going to give you your road funding. So they gave, I think it was a 3-year window, and cities had to come up with it. Now, whether or not they adopt the plan, there is the next steps of conversion, but tying other funding to it was very compelling from our state legislature.
I'll chime in that you kind of list all like, okay, do we do this or this? Or that? I wanted to say yes, like that's kind of all of it, and part of it too is like how you define success. I mean, it's going to be different depending on where you are in terms of where your expectations are. But I guess the one maybe theme that I've seen kind of like stick is being okay with incremental progress, and that was definitely the story in California. I mean, there, in the early years, there was a lot of things that were tried that just didn't make its way through, and so they kind of made these into smaller, bite-sized pieces, and then like the next legislature built on that, and then built on it. And people got, and next thing you turn around, you're like, oh my God, we can now have 6 ADUs in our backyard in San Diego, that kind of thing. But it wasn't like an all at once. And the other, for those who may not be familiar, there's an organization called Casita Coalition. They're headquartered in California. They work with different states, though. They came out with a playbook, basically taking what worked in California and in Montana and other states, and like here's sort of the different scenarios. So if you Google Casita Coalition playbook, I'm sure you can find it. And it's a pretty good handbook. It's very practical.
The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas Coalition includes several state agencies. It's complete, it's online, and they've been actually looking at a number of things, including mobile and manufactured housing, where those are allowed, lot sizes, and I think their analysis is, just, again, something that can be discussed on with state legislators, and hopefully those conversations are starting to happen to inform where we are in New Hampshire and how incremental change or maybe bigger change can help.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you for all the great questions, and I want to say thank you to this great panel. It's been awesome being able to have this conversation with you.
I'm just going to hop up here for 1 second before Ben comes and gives us all of our instructions. I wanted to just let folks know, you may have heard some a little bit